Hello, everyone. I hope you had a good summer. I'm Linda Ayers, wearing my well-worn Woodley Park t-shirt. I want to welcome you to the beginning of the fall session of Tuesday Talks DC, which is brought to you by the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village, Cleveland Park Main Street, Woodley Park Main Street, and the DC Public Library. We hope you'll join in the conversation tonight by posting your comments and questions online at any time using the chat function on your screen. After tonight's presentation, Pat Whitty from the Village will moderate a Q&A session with our speaker, who is Judith Waxman, the unofficial historian of Woodley Park. She'll be talking about the history of Woodley Park, and it seems to be a popular topic. We have more than 190 people registered tonight for this webinar. In 2005, Judy led the team to rehabilitate the 8 historic call boxes in the community. She went on to become an oral historian and has worked on projects such as the DC Collaborative, the Women's March, and the Pioneers History Project, among others. Judy is also one of the nation's leading healthcare law and policy analysts. She's worked as a senior staff leader in health and reproductive rights policy at the National Women's Law Center, Families USA, the National Health Law Program, and the Department of Health and Human Services. From 1989 to 91, Judy served as senior staff analyst at the U.S. Bipartisan Commission on Universal Health Care. This created a universal health care plan, which evolved into the Affordable Care Act. Since 2019, Judy has taught reproductive health policy and law, as well as a survey course on women's health at George Washington University. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you so much. Pleased to be here. Shall we begin? Okay. I got to share screen. I'm right with you. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to start right in, starting with the boundaries of Woodley Park. So as you can see, Connecticut Avenue is prominent, and it comes around to Klingle and Woodley Road, down to 34th Street, over to Cleveland Avenue. I'm going to move this up a little. Went too far. Here are the 2 hotels, one remaining, one not, coming down here around Cathedral Avenue, and takes in the apartment buildings, but not the zoo, and back around to the Kennedy Warren to Klingle Road. That's the boundaries that we have. So let's start at the beginning. It's believed that this was an ancient quarry in the land that we are on. There was a tribe there that was named Natachtank, part of the Algonquin community. The settlers could not pronounce that name, so they kept changing it to Nakachian, Nakastian, and finally Anacastian, which is where we have names, still the Anacostia River and Anacostia community. This land was given to the king by Lord Calvert, 7 million acres, and a man named Neenan Bell bought 775 acres. And of course, in 1703, of course, it was still called Maryland then. What happened was he sold some of the land to 2 people, and I mentioned this, Uriah Forrest and Benjamin Stoddard, because they bought a chunk of the land and they called it Pretty Prospect. In time, Pretty Prospect was renamed Rosedale, and Rosedale is still there. That was 1783. Of course, Rosedale is 3501 Newark Street now. And after that, In 1798, Philip Barton Key bought 250 acres from Stoddard and Forest and built this edifice here. This was Woodley Mansion. Now, Philip Barton Key is an interesting character. First of all, he was the uncle of Francis Scott Key, and he was actually a loyalist. He fled the country during the war. He went to London and studied at the Inns Court, came back as a lawyer. And when he came back, he married a wealthy woman from Maryland. And together they built this house. As you can see, well, you might not be able to see so much from this picture, but we all know it in person. It has kind of an English look to it, as does the rest of our community. And he called it Woodley Manor after an estate that he knew of in England. He raised 8 children there and had 11 slaves. Okay. They lived there for quite a number of years, and then he died. And down here you will see Woodley, spelled a little differently, for sale or rent. So this is 1819, and Mrs. Key, Anne Key, wanted to sell the property. And it's obviously, this is very hard to read, but it talks about how it has royal comforts, it has a substantial brick edifice, spacious gardens, and can be divided if the seller wants to do it. I also thought this was interesting. This is from 1819, as I said, to look at some of the other ads. There's to hire a Negro girl, about 13, to be sold, very likely Negro man, for sale, a valuable Negro woman. Then along with that is the milliner and the Irish linens, and just very different time, right? But it's all right here in this particular ad. This is a map, moving on a little bit. This is a map from 1862. This is Rock Creek Park here on this side. And on this side is what was called the Georgetown Tenleytown Road, of course, as we now know it as Wisconsin Avenue. Let me tell you a little who all these people were. First of all, there's the Mount Auburn Church over here. It's got a cathedral with it now, but that's what was there in 1862. L. Thomas is Lorenzo Thomas. He owned Woodley at the time. I'll get back to him. Curvan had a big property, and actually she was the first person to try to sell some of her lands. She advertised lands that could be 2 to 10 acres, and it was a, quote, 20-minute walk from the P Street Circle. She thought that the houses would attract middle and upper class residents, and she promised a combination of the best rural and urban life. Next is, this is actually Captain French. He was dead by then, but it was his heirs. And he had gone to West Point with Jefferson Davis. So an interesting story is that during the Civil War, when the Union soldiers would be camping out along Rock Creek, there was a rumor that that was Jefferson Davis's house, which it was not, but he did spend summertime there. And so the soldiers like raided the whole place, and the people that lived there had to get out of there because it was getting kind of dangerous. Dr. Holt bought this house and eventually sold it to the zoo. I believe it's still there, and it's an administrative building. And of course, you know, Pierce Mill is what's up here. So not too many people in 1862, large estates. L. Thomas, as I started to say, was he owned the manor at the time. He was a Union general, Secretary of War under Grant, and actually a major player in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. In 1862, DC passed the Emancipation Act. So there, of course, were still slaves at Woodley. And you can see here, this is the actual letter that Thomas got. And you can see that Lucy Berry, who was the mom, 43 years old, a cook and so forth, and her two children, George and Lorenzo, interestingly, they got, Lorenzo Thomas got money for them, $800 for Lucy and $100 for each of her children. They were, of course, compensated by the city. The teacher at Murray at the time had the students do a lot of research on the Berries, and very interestingly, they found a lot about the family. They relocated to Georgetown, which was a heavily African-American community then, and her whole family, other children and her parent and her husband found each other there. So they lived there for a while across from what's now Rose Park, and she ultimately worked at St. Elizabeth's. Moving on, now we are in, wait a minute, did I skip a slide? Oh, no. Okay, this is 1888. So you can see there's no real, the Massachusetts is only proposed. There's no real Connecticut Avenue, but Woodley Park is here. There's the proposed zoo, as we know it, going all the way up to Klingle Road. It didn't go quite that far, ultimately. This is the, really it was called the Slave Cemetery, which we know is still there. And Woodley Lane was the road that went all the way from Rock Creek Park. There was a Woodley Lane Bridge in the late 1800s there. It was like a wooden bridge, Woodley Lane Bridge. And it went up from here and followed all the way around the long and winding road, as they call it. It went all the way to the Georgetown Tenley Town Road. I'm going to go back to this to show you that Woodley Road, Woodley Lane, in a way, is still here, but it's not the same road anymore. See if I can move this up slightly. Okay, so can't really do it, but shoot, I really want to. So let me get that up. So, okay, I'm going to hold it here. So coming from Rock Creek Park down at the bottom, there was the road, and it went over what would now be Shoreham Drive. We got it. Shoreham Drive up to 24th Street, a teeny bit of what's now Connecticut Avenue. Woodley Road, that's still Woodley, and it curved here, and now this is 29th Street. And this part now is Cathedral Avenue, but Woodley picks up again over here at around 31st Street off of Cathedral. So Woodley is still there, but when the streets were imposed, the straight lines were imposed in the late 1800s, the names changed. Of course, Cathedral Avenue at one time was Hartford because it came after Garfield, right? But it changed when the cathedral was born. So let's go back to where I was. Okay, so that's where, as you follow this, the road, as I said, is really kind of still there. Okay, so now we have once again, late 1800s, that Woodley Lane Bridge really wasn't sufficient. It was little, it was rickety, and so Congress dedicated money to have a new bridge, and people called it the $1 million bridge. It actually was not $1 million. It was actually cost $850,000, but we all know this bridge is the same bridge that is still there, And of course, there were proposals over the year to put streetcars, but I would say, luckily, that never happened. Of course, over time, the name got changed to the Taft Bridge because President Taft lived in the area and walked on it a lot. So in honor of him, that the bridge got renamed. You can see this is an early picture. This is the bridge that went over Rock Creek, which was replaced by our Calvert Street Bridge, or the Duke Ellington Bridge. But at the time, what happened was, you may have heard of Senator Newlands. He wanted to have Chevy Chase be a development. So he put a lot of money into getting a streetcar going. And the streetcar went all the way from 7th and U, up across U, up to 18th and up Calvert and across this bridge. It was a streetcar that then ultimately, and we'll talk about Connecticut Avenue, but it ultimately went out to Chevy Chase. Maybe I'll say now, so on Connecticut Avenue, he built that too, Senator Newlands, and he'd asked Olmsted, Frederick Olmsted, who was the landscape architect who had a lot to do with the zoo. He asked him what he thought he ought to do. I mean, this was all really parkland. And so what Olmsted suggested was, we'll have one major road with like a river and the tributaries off of it. And that's kind of how we got Connecticut Avenue with all of our streets off of it. This bridge, of course, was replaced ultimately by the Calvert Street Bridge. Now, the beginning of development were like this house here and these other houses on Connecticut Avenue. There were 2 or 3 stories. And Thomas Wagaman bought land and developed some of this. Again, this was the late 1800s. This was intended to be a fashionable area. So in fact, here's the ad. Here, within a few minutes ride from the noisy heart of the city, you may lie within the sounds of its bells and yet find yourself fairly submerged in the full flood tide of nature, as far removed from the canned life of the city as though you were many miles in the country. And this was his house for a while. During that period, from around 1905 to 1910, 144 houses were built. This is like 27th Street, 28th Street. And the 1910 census said that there were 91 families, solidly middle and upper class, government workers, clerks, construction engineers, lawyers, businessmen, and journalists. The majority of the wealthy had live-in servants and owned their homes. So that's what the community was like a little more than 100 years ago. As you can see, the style here and on the other streets was kind of English. It was subdued delicacy of scale and restraint of decorative details. Another interesting thing that I saw, and that's not necessarily on Connecticut, but on the other streets, 27, 28, that the houses were somewhat set back from the street, which was different than earlier parts of the city. That was like an innovation to create green space. All right, I don't know if you recognize this or not, but this is the Wardman Inn that was opened in 1918. People called it Wardman's Folly because it was so far out of town that they thought nobody's ever going to come to this inn, but it lasted a while. Wardman also was a very interesting person, a son of a textile worker in England, and he immigrated to the United States. 35 years after he arrived with 7 shillings in his pocket, allegedly, he was worth $30 million, which of course in those years was gigantic. He did build a bunch of houses in our community, including mine on Cathedral Avenue, the Hay Adams, the British Embassy, and other all around the city. In 1925, he claimed that he had built 10% of the city, and that very well could be. The hotel, which cost $5 million to build, was a kind of quasi resort. And one fact I like to say about it is that it had 32 miles of carpet, a lot of hallways and rooms. There were TV shows for forecasts from there, the Today Show, Advice and Consent. And also, you may know that Langston Hughes was a busboy there, which is how that restaurant got the name Busboys and Poets. Comes from this hotel. The Shoreham, which I don't have a picture of, was built in 1930, originally as an apartment building. The story goes that on opening night, Rudy Valley was to perform, but the plane stopped in New Jersey because of a storm, and he finally got there at 4:15 a.m. A lot of people stayed. He played for 15 minutes and got his money. Apparently, it was Marilyn Monroe's favorite hotel. So maybe that's why she landed on our building. And an interesting little tidbit is that Harry Trudman had a regular poker game there in room 406D regularly. The first commercial property here, this one on Connecticut Avenue, was a family had a tailor shop in the basement, and they wanted to bring it on up and make it a full business, and neighbors didn't like it. There was a senator on the block that did not want that to happen. To make a long story short, the debate went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can have a business there. So really within about 10 years, that was 1923, by 1930, every row house here on the avenue was a business. I guess that might have been the end of the fashionable community. Moving on, this is when also in the 20s, this is an ad for Cathedral Mansions, which was called A City Within Itself, but had all kinds of services, as these places did, stores and restaurants and lots of services within the city, buses or whatever it was, streetcars, I don't know, something down to downtown. And, I did some of the call boxes. I know some of you went on that tour with me, and we do have one that talks about how in order to build this, 125 tons of dirt had to be removed because it was a cliff. And Wardman did this one, and he built it as the largest apartment building south of New York City. At one point in the 80s, there was some developers wanted to build townhouses right on the front lawn, but that was defeated. But I think we all know that one. Okay, so the next one is 1925. This is actually the original deed from my home. And I thought two parts of it were very interesting. And I've underlined them. So any part of the property shall not be used for mercantile or manufacturing purposes. And I assume that's because of what was going on Connecticut Avenue just a couple of years before that. They did not want commercial, people did not want commercial property. I live on, I live on right past 29th Street on Cathedral. The other thing that I've underlined is no part thereof shall ever be sold, transferred, leased, rented to, nor occupied by any Negro or person of African blood. I will leave that there, but as we know, in the 40s, the Supreme Court outlawed these kinds of restrictive covenants. Of course, our neighborhood is still kind of white, and we can talk about that. The next pictures, this is actually Harry's own home. It was on the corner of Connecticut and Woodley. And so this was his house, and he lived there with his wife and daughter. It was very grand, as you could see. And the story goes that his wife and daughter went to Italy to find her respectable husband, and 2 days later he had the whole thing raised, and this is what he put up instead. There we go. Boardman Tower. When his wife came home, she was, not that pleased, but there was this grand part of the hotel at the time. Again, to talk about prominent people, Eisenhower and Hoover did live there at that time. Of course, it became condos, as we know, not that long ago. And I do have to say that I'm always a little chagrined when I pass the two big signs that say 2 residents left for sale, $4,750,000. Okay. Now, this is Klingle Bridge. As you can see, we're moving into the 1930s. And this bridge was redone. It did replace a bridge that Senator Newlands had there. And the interesting thing I think about this, it costs a lot of money, but as they redid it, as you could see, they kept traffic flowing. This obviously the Kennedy Warren back there. And really kind of interesting to see. Whoops. Is that right? Yes. Here we go. This was, again, Woodley. Last time it was a private residence. I kind of skipped over a lot of the people that live there, but just to mention two before we talk about this year's is President Van Buren lived there during his time at presidency. And this summer, this was like way out in the country, high up, away from the heat, kind of. So Van Buren lived there, and President Cleveland, he had his house, which was at 35th and Macomb, I think. And when he lost his second election, he sold it, went back to Buffalo, but then he won 4 years later, and he rented Woodley as his summer place. So Cleveland did live in this area also. At this time, this was Stimson, as you see. He was the Secretary of War for Roosevelt. And again, the story goes that he was having lunch and Roosevelt called and said, "Did you hear what happened? Pearl Harbor was bombed." And supposedly that's where the first time he heard about it. Okay, early 1950s, big change. The Murray School buys the Woodley estate. And so that the Murray sisters were Swiss French, and they, in the Progressive era, started a girls' school in their house near Dupont Circle. They moved up to Colorama, and finally they needed a lot more space. So they bought this property, and then it became co-ed after that. I found this article and I wanted to show it because there was a question at the time. They couldn't afford the whole property. At that point, it was only 18 acres. See it up here. So they sold the back part to developers, and the original property went down to Cleveland Avenue along 29th Street. So Woodley neighbors mobilized again to fight rezoning. I mean, these Woodley neighbors, they've been busy for a long time. So as you can see, there was no road here. Here's where Woodley stopped. And as I showed you, we went up 29th and over this way. But the developer proposed a new road, which became Garfield. And it was really this part over here that they wanted to build apartments, and the neighbors were able to defeat that particular proposal. I put this little red triangle in here because I wanted to point out that Woodley Road curved around, and curved around up here too as it went to Cathedral. And if you go to 29th, where Woodley and now Garfield come together, this little triangle of like a little park area. And that's really why it's there, because when the straight roads were put on, that kind of left this little space. I mean, I live up over here and this does curve. It's a big curve. We don't have a little park there though. Okay, next one. Whoops, sorry, I keep doing that. Well, as we know, by the time we got to the 70s, there was proposed metro, and a controversy about that, which some of you may know. The people in Wisconsin Avenue and Georgetown didn't want it, but the people by Connecticut Avenue did want it. Everybody testified, and then it was announced that there would be the stop in Woodley Park, but they were going to call it the Zoological Park. So I read an article that said when the name was announced, like a grand urban phoenix, Woodley Park rose, meaning again, neighbors were like, this isn't Zoological Park, that's up a ways, we're Woodley Park. So ultimately the stop was named Woodley Park Zoo, and of course you can hardly see it, but Adams Morgan was added some years later. That of course changed a lot of the community. I put this slide here to show you that in the 80s we got an historic district, but it is not all of Woodley Park. It really is some of the commercial area and also the houses that were built by about 1910. So even though there was much development in the 20s and beyond, this is the historic district. And last but not least, I want to show you this slide because I got this from DC History Center. They have posters for just about every neighborhood, and this is how ours is depicted. And I think it's pretty nice. You can see here sort of what it looks, the boundaries kind of down here, where we are in the district, and obviously the fashionable part of our community right there. So that's it. I'd love to take some questions. I'll shut this off. There we go.
Hello. I'm not sure whether I'm on here yet, but I think so. Judy, that was wonderful.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You're so full of information, and my understanding is that we may be having an issue with the chat. So I'm going to start with a few questions, and then if anyone can try to get into the chat, we'll follow up. First question we had, you mentioned the call boxes, and I know you were kind enough to do a walking tour of the call boxes in Woodley Park. But for those of us who weren't able to take the tour, could you talk a little bit more about those call boxes?
Sure. There are 8 of them in Woodley Park. And there was a committee that this is now 20 years ago, and there was a committee that got together. I had done a lot of the historic research, so I put together a lot of the words and the photos to go on a plaque, but other people contributed to the painting and of course to the cost of putting them all together. So we have one right in front of what is now Murray, the Woodley estate. And I should say an interesting fact about that is I have 2 children who are 17 years apart, and both of them went to Murray for part of their education, but way different times. When my son was there, they called that big house the Manor House, but when my younger daughter came, it was already called Woodley. So just a little different focus on what that building was. Anyway, that picture I showed you, the drawing of Woodley when it was first built, is on that first call box right at Cathedral and Woodley. I don't know if I remember them all, but I have one of Wardman and Mesrobian. He was the man that built the Wardman Tower with him. And there's one about the $1 Million Bridge. There's another one about Wardman himself. There's one in front of the zoo that talks about how 150 tons of dirt had to be removed. That's only 4. That's what comes to mind right. Oh, I know there's the Long and Winding Road. There's one about that. There's one about, oh, I know another one. There's about the priest that started St. Thomas is on one, and another neighbor who was King Edward's wife, the woman he had to marry and abdicated the throne for. I'm losing her name, but her mother had a boarding house in Woodley Park. So that's 5, I think I came up with.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. You mentioned an African-American cemetery, and some of us are not quite sure exactly where that is. Can you help us out?
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's not actually in Woodley Park. If you go across the Calvert Street Bridge, it is, there's a little building that was a bus turnaround. It's really right past there. I guess that's Adams Morgan already. And actually recently, some plaques have been put up there to explain how it was a place where enslaved people were buried, and a lot about the people and the community. And that has been there and was not touched in any of the building of the bridge, or it's right next to Pierce Park, if that's familiar. Anyway, that's where it is, over the bridge, not far past the bridge.
Okay, I think it's on what would be the north side of the bridge, the north side of Calvert.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, another question. These questions, they come from all directions. Do you know what crops were grown on the Woodley estate?
I don't, but I could look it up. But mostly I do know that the French, that Captain French's estate, what I have read is that the soldiers raided the place, and there were all kinds of fruit trees of all different kinds, and that's what they basically took to eat themselves. So I'm going to assume that the Woodley estate also had a lot of fruit trees and other kinds of fruits on the property. Good question.
Another question, why is Hawthorne Street why does it have such an odd configuration? It dead ends in the back of the Murray.
Right. I just went over there because I've been looking at these maps, and from different years, they seem to have different streets. Well, as I mentioned, when the street names were, when the design of all the straight streets was moved from what we called the city to the county, I don't know if you're aware, but Florida Avenue was called Boundary Road. And that actually divided the city from the county. But once, now we're talking late 1800s, the streets were extended. And so then Cathedral was, Hartford. And there were, but then that disappeared. So Hawthorne Street, which I assume was developed a little later, was not part of the Woodley estate. That's where it ended. So you will find on Cathedral Avenue, right next to the school estate, if you want to call it that, the school grounds, there are houses on both sides of the street. And so that left a clump of land that was not developed, that was not part of the Woodley estate, not part of the 7 3/4 acres that the Murray sisters bought.
I see. Okay. What is the history, if you know, of the 2800 Woodley Road apartment building? Who built it?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay,
Sorry.
maybe some of our listeners know something and can put it in the chat.
I mean, I think that's the one that is empty. Is that the one that it's, oh no, that's Old Cathedral. I'm sorry, I don't know. I'll just stop right there.
Okay. You talked early on about the construction of the Taft Bridge, but you didn't say anything about the Lions.
Oh, yes. Well, that was specifically designed in that it was near the zoo. And I'm, of course, blanking on the architect of the bridge. But you will note, in addition to the lions, and there is one up by the entrance to the zoo on Connecticut Avenue, but also apparently the lights are very unique, the light poles, and they are designated historic as well.
They're great. Do you know anything about the history of the Oyster School?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad I skipped that. I was trying to keep within the time. So the Oyster School was built in 1926. There started to be a lot more children in the area. And you know, progressed for a while. You know, there was a big plot of land, I remember, before that apartment building was built, a big plot of land so the kids could play outside as well. Well, by the 60s, 1954, when segregation was declared illegal in schools by the Supreme Court, it really didn't affect the school very much because Woodley Park was only about 2% non-white anyway. But in the 60s, the population of children started to go down, and around 1970, they hired a teacher who spoke Spanish, and they decided to make it into a bilingual school. And of course, they joined up with the Adams School, that's in Adams Morgan. And since then, it's really a unique place, one of the few bilingual schools in the country for that age child. And of course, it is quite integrated now, very much so.
Since you mentioned the Adams School in Adams Morgan, we have a question here from someone who recently moved to Adams Morgan. And this person is wondering if you can talk about the connections and differences between Woodley Park and Adams Morgan, as well as the racial history and or gentrification of the area.
Not too much, because I don't know all that much about Adams Morgan, but I do know that during the 60s and 70s, it was a hotbed, shall we say, of civil rights activities, and not so much in Woodley Park. And it was very sort of active community as compared to our own. I don't know the statistics, but it's always appeared to me anyway, I've lived here 40 years, and it has appeared to be to much more diverse population than we have. And that's why joining the schools, I think, really helped both schools integrate their schools.
Thank you. A question about the houses on the west side of Murray, between Murray and 34th Street. And between Cathedral and Garfield, were those all built by Wardman, and were they built in the 1920s?
Let me get this straight. Between Cathedral and Garfield, no, they were not built in the 20s. So first of all, there is the Woodley estate, of course, and I live right across from there, so I'm looking south in my mind to tell you. So of course, along 29th Street is the Swiss Embassy, and that's been there since around 1941. And other houses were built, I don't know exactly when, past the embassy grounds towards Garfield. And then that whole area that I talked about, that's south of Garfield, they were all built in the 50s, after it was declared to be a residential area, not apartments. And so there's a few windy streets in that development that lead you up to Cleveland Avenue.
Okay. For clarification, which one was Wardman's Hotel? Is it where the Shoreham is now, or was it on the?
Oh,
property
sorry,
of the
no, it
one down?
was, it's now the one that's being destroyed. It was raised when the Sheridan Corporation took it over. And then now, of course, that one's being raised to put in place apartment buildings instead of a hotel. So the Shoreham still exists as it was from the 30s.
Okay, and the Shoreham is the one that was built as an apartment by Wardman and was the largest apartment out of New York?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I went through this so quickly. The largest apartment is Cathedral Mansions on Connecticut.
Okay.
That was his. But he did build the hotel originally. It was an inn, and I guess he thought that people might reside there permanently. Certainly Shoreham had permanent residents, but they both became active hotels. And of course, I want to also say Wardman Tower was a part of even the Sheridan Hotel. But of course became condos not that long ago.
Another detailed question. When did Woodley without the E become Woodley with the E?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm looking here. So I have a brochure. As I mentioned, both my children went to Murray for part of their career, and I have a brochure here that they put together. It's funny, we thought this was the 100th year anniversary, but then some of the students did research and it turned out we thought it was 1802, but it was 1801, so we missed it by a year. But anyway, this has Woodley with an E. So that's the original.
There you go. There you go. I've got so many good questions here. You noted the racial restrictions in the covenants on your property, and I'm sure on others. Is it notable that there were no religious restrictions?
That's great. That's a good question. Yeah, I, being Jewish myself, was sort of hoping there would have been a religious restriction. Certainly would have applied to me if there were one. But no, really, actually in the 20s, the Jewish population really resided on the east side of the park, not so much on the west side of the park. And that seems to be just by choice. And I do recall reading about how Jewish families told their children, you can't date across the park because it's different classes, not so much different religion, but they didn't want their children mixing, the Russian Jews, I'll say, with the German Jews, had a big divide.
One of our viewers comments that he or she loves the Marilyn Monroe mural. Do you know how that came about?
Well, I do know, I have it here. I do know that it was, I'm going to find this in my notes. Let's see, it was commissioned, it was originally done in 1982. And the then owner of the building, Roy Bernard of Roy's, which was there at the time, he commissioned the mural, and it was painted by someone named John Bailey. So when I would tell people I lived in Woodley Park, they would say, oh, Marilyn, because it was done like with a high gloss and enamel lips and pieces of mirror in the eyes. So if you would ride up Connecticut Avenue, you couldn't miss it because it kind of shines in your eyes. And it has been refurbished twice. And obviously it's now a thing in the city and in other cities to do murals of different people. It was really Roy and his partner that picked Maryland.
And I think you said that Maryland, that what the hotel was Maryland's favorite hotel.
Yes, yes, maybe he knew that. I don't know. I
Excellent.
do know that Roy and his partner, who lived up 16th Street for a while, they had a Maryland mosaic in their pool. So I guess they wanted to spread her around more.
Someone asked, could you tell the busboys and poets story again?
Oh, just that Langston Hughes was literally a busboy at the Wardman Inn. And there are all kinds of stories about how he served famous people and told his poems to certain people who then promoted him. And of course, he stopped being a busboy. And when I mentioned Busboy and Poets, that's the restaurant. There's one on 14th Street, there's one in Tacoma Park, there's, I think, one at the wharf. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that's where that name came from.
Interesting. Interesting. Do you know when those big grand trees, many of which are now gone, but some of which remain on the front of the Murray property, the Woodley property, do you know when they were planted or how old they are?
What I do know is that when the Murray sisters got the zoning permission to change the house into a school, a condition was that they leave the front yard, I'll call it. So they couldn't change, that they couldn't change, obviously trees come and go. But so from 1950 on, it was required that that the front one would not have buildings. So if anyone knows the school, a lot of buildings have been built now on the sides of the mansion, and they have a field in the back, but the front lawn stays as it is.
I'm going to be pushing up against time, and there's so many wonderful questions. One of them is, would you consider turning your presentation with the slides into a booklet that could be sold in the community?
Oh, wow. Yes, I would. But, you know, there is a book in that, well, I have it on my shelf. I won't get it. But in the series, you know, they're brown covered with a lot of pictures in them of different communities. There is one of Woodley Park. And I did confer with the author at the time that he put it together. And actually, that's where I got the picture of the indigenous people came out of that book. So I think that's a great idea for me. Maybe I should do that anyway. But it's pretty, the Woodley Park one is pretty essential. There's also another one about Woodley itself that the history teacher wrote and put together. I knew him, and he really taught his American history class right out of the building. I mean, I didn't talk too much about you know, who lived there, but a lot of people that had some significance over time. I'll just say one more. There was a man named oh shoot, I'm drawing a blank. Sorry, I'm going to look real fast. It was Robert Walker. He purchased the building in 1866, and he had worked with the Tsar of Russia and enabled the United States to bar Alaska. And so he got a big bribe for that from the Tsar, and that's how the third floor got built. So the building itself, you know, has lots of people who lived there, who came there, you know, and actually, as I say, the teacher had started what he called a Woodley Society and had the students doing amazing research, which is where they found all that about the Berry family, which I thought was great to make these enslaved people real people.
Okay, my clock tells me that I'm supposed to stop. I apparently am not able to put anything in the chat myself, but Judy has very graciously said that if you have additional questions, or if I didn't get to your question, you can write her and ask, and her email address is judywaxman2913@gmail.com. Judy, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm going to turn you back over to Linda.
Super.
Judy, thanks again. That was just terrific, and we appreciate your taking the time and sharing with all of us that fascinating history of Woodley Park. As one of the audience members wrote in, terrific talk, please have some more. And we will. We've been having them since 2000, I think. And next October 18th, we have Pulitzer Prize winning political cartoonist Matt Worker, another Woodley Park resident. And his title is, "If You're Not Confused, You're Not Thinking Clearly." And on November 15th, New York Times writer Peter Baker and his wife, New Yorker staff writer Susan Glasser, will be live in person at the Cleveland Park Library talking about their new book, The Divider, which just came out this month. And there will be a book signing on November 15th as well. So we hope to see all of you back here on October 18th, November 15th. Until then, be well and good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Judy.